this is going to be one of those days, folks. Already has been, as a matter of fact. So we are here. We're starting a little bit late, obviously. There's the best laid plans of mice and men, or man plans and God laughs, all those kinds of silly things. Had this thing ready to go. Thought I had all my ducks in a row finally, and then took my son to a doctor's appointment. And I had to stop at home for just a second. He wanted to pick up something to take back with him to school to show off a friend. And going out the door, he tripped and fell, skinned his knee in the sidewalk. There was all kinds of stuff going on. So that put us behind. And then who knows what kind of technical issues we had now. Anyway, we're here. We're started a bit late, but here we go. This is BreatheTV. My name is Mike Hess. I'm a respiratory therapist and COPD advocate. I run the Facebook page COPD Navigator, the Facebook group COPD Navigator, and hoping to add some other media to our Navigator Nation before too long here. What we do here, if you're new to the program, is about every 2 weeks, hopefully on Wednesday, hopefully around noon Eastern time. Never quite works out like that, but we have time to get together and talk about COPD. We know that we need to raise a lot more awareness of how things work and how help people understand what COPD is and what we can do about these things. And that is what we are here to do. So today we start off with some news of the day. We start off with a few different news topics, and we go into our topic of the day, which is going to be symptom recognition today. And then we get into question and answer time for you. So we've posted this a couple of different places. Hopefully people are seeing the video. If you have a comment, if you have a question, go ahead and throw that in the comments. Try to do it on the original video if possible. It makes it a heck of a lot easier for me to see it and for me to get to it in a relatively timely fashion. Depending on the question, we get it covered during the when it's asked, or it may wait toward the end. So make sure stick around. And if you aren't able to watch the whole thing, we do get these up. They're available on YouTube eventually. They're also available on the archive through Facebook. So without further ado, we are going to first talk about some of our news items today. And this is kind of tying in a little bit with our topic last time around, which was sleep medicine. New studies come out that has linked poor sleep to COPD exacerbation, which probably doesn't surprise a whole lot of people. If you're not breathing well, then you're probably not sleeping well. And if you're not sleeping well, then you're pretty tired and you're not dealing with your symptoms very well. But now we have proof that that is actually a thing, with a new study that came out, is actually in press right now, which is about to be published in a journal called Chest, which is part of the American College of Chest Physicians. It's their publication. You can read this online now at that link below. What this study did was looked at a group called the Canadian Cohort of Obstructive Lung Disease, or CAN-COLD. And what they did with that is they actually did phone surveys and that sort of thing, tried to recruit some people, and then ended up doing spirometry on them to find out who had COPD, who had been told they had COPD, maybe didn't, and who were the healthy control. So this Canadian group found about 480 people. Did we lose our signal here? No, we're still okay. Some of the stuff blanks out a little bit, so if I, and considering all the other tech issues we've had today, I apologize if I make a sudden weird looking face, or if it's just my usual face also looking weird. In any event, we're looking at these Canadians, 480 people who were spirometrically found to have COPD. But most of them, sadly enough, were only found during the recruitment process for this CAN-COLD research data, which means that we're still not doing a very good job of accurately diagnosing a lot of people with these breathing disorders. So they evaluated them further with this thing called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which measures subjective trouble sleeping. Things like, are you comfortable? Is your face hot? Is your face cold? Does your room partner or bed partner tell you that you snore? Do you have daytime sleepiness? A couple of different things. It's I believe it's 18 questions long. Looks a little bit more deeply than something like the Epworth scale that we talked about last time. Certainly more than the stop bang screener thing that we found. This actually looks a little bit more at sleep quality. And they looked at exacerbations, which is of course the topic of the day. So it's a nice little bridge from last time. And they looked at two different types of exacerbations, and we'll get into a little bit more about why that's a factor sometimes later on. They looked at what they called symptom-based exacerbations, where you had at least one of increased shortness of breath, or increased sputum, mucus, phlegm, junk production, or if it changed color a bit, like they say if it became purulent, if it became thicker and greener and nastier, that lasted at least 48 hours. So this differentiated it from the normal waxing and waning up and downs of symptoms. They also looked at event-based exacerbations, which are basically those symptom exacerbations plus a healthcare encounter, whether it was an emergency room, full-on admission, or use of an antibiotic or corticosteroid. And what they found is that every 2-point bump in this Pittsburgh score, which, in an 18-19 question thing, that goes, I believe, from 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 each question. Not a whole lot of that doesn't, a step of 2 doesn't really sound like a lot of change. They found like every 2-point increase in this Pittsburgh score was associated with about a 10% increase in exacerbation risk. And there was a stronger relationship in the group of people who had COPD and spirometry, but had not yet been diagnosed, which again kind of makes sense, because that's telling us that those people who have not been diagnosed are not on a good management plan, have greater disruptions and greater sensitivity to disordered sleep, which tells us again that how critical it is to do a better job at these screening and diagnostic things. In addition, we already know that undiagnosed sleep apnea is a risk factor for exacerbations, so this is another indication that we need to do a better job of screening and diagnosis in sleep health. And it tells us that the risk also likely goes both ways. Now the volume was working. I heard it myself. Hello? Well, it's showing up on the screen. And hello? This is probably a good time to remind folks to make sure your volume is turned up and all that good stuff. So we've got some volume. Some people can hear, some people can't. Make sure that your volume is up. Make sure it's set to stereo. Some of the Facebook posts have told us that if you have a fancy computer and it's doing some kind of surround sound, sometimes the audio doesn't come through. Let me check one other thing, because I'm seeing some weird stuff with some of the video too here. What's kind of weird is in the video itself, it looks okay. But in one of these watch parties that I tried to set up, yep, there we go. So audio definitely coming through, although I do see in some of the watch party modes, it's not working very well. So again, go right to the original video, and that way we can make sure we get all the comments and all that stuff going on. But we are gonna push on a little bit here. So moral of the story for this first news item is make sure you're getting enough sleep. And if you feel that if you've got these daytime sleepiness issues, if you've got problems, if you've been told that you snore, if you have all that stuff going on, make sure you're getting checked out, at the very least with some screening through a sleep medicine physician or a sleep medicine provider, or preferably with some kind of sleep testing, whether it's a home sleep test, an in-lab polysomnography, or something like that, because that will help keep you healthier longer. So moving on to e-cigarettes. We talked about this a couple of episodes ago. Whether or not electronic cigarettes are a relevant, practical, helpful way to help people quit smoking. What are the risks? What are the potential damages, potential problems involved with these things? And again, I'm not sure, folks. Like I said, I've got another computer set up here watching the video, and when I pull up the actual video, we'll probably hear it in the background here in just a second. As soon as the video buffers up, okay. Every time I try to show one of these things, it starts buffering again. So I don't know. We got network issues. We got, I'm not sure exactly what's going on. I can tell you the audio is going out. So unfortunately, I don't know what the audio problems are. But again, make sure your volume's turned up. Make sure that your devices are set appropriately. And make sure that you're watching or getting this in stereo and not some kind of surround sound. So as we look at some of these electronic cigarette things, the recent article that was just published in the American Journal, or the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, looked at the direct effects of some of these vapor ingredients to the cells that line your blood vessels. They're called endothelial cells. And what they found was perhaps not terribly surprising. They found increased what they call cytotoxicity or poisoning of the cells associated with the flavors of these e-cigarette juices. It wasn't even so much the nicotine, it wasn't even so much the preservatives or the carriers or anything else. I mean, all those things are still bad, generally speaking, but they found that some of the biggest damage actually came from the flavorings. What they did was they got some of these cells. They figured out how to make the stem cells, which are the kind of the progenitor cells for all of the different cell types in our bodies. They figured out how to make them from a person's own blood cells for this relatively limited application. So they were able to take these blood cells, turn them into stem cells, and then turn those into epithelial lining cells. And then they exposed them to these vape juice ingredients. And they found that the cells in these epithelial cells died faster. They had more inflammation, and they had a couple of other things that were wrong with them based on a disruption in what's called a nitric oxide process, or the nitric oxide metabolism inside the cell. It was really arguably more so than tobacco, and certainly more than just nicotine alone. They found that of the flavors they tried, and unfortunately this part was firewalled, so I couldn't get a lot of the actual details behind it beyond the some of the top line stuff. They found that cinnamon flavorings appeared to be the worst for a lot of these cells, followed by those menthol flavorings. So again, it's not even necessarily the carrier fluids or anything like that, it's these ingredients. Now, a couple of caveats here. Things in the cell don't always behave, or things in the lab don't always behave the same as they do inside the body. So even in this journal, there was an editorial that was talking about how we need to look at, we need to try and look at animal models and other kinds of there's the volume. Again, it's not even necessarily. So we're looking at, we need to look at these models a little bit more in more detail. But of course that also takes time. You know, we don't want to be putting people necessarily in a, I'm just going to adjust the angle there real quick. We don't necessarily want to be exposing people to these things and then harvesting their epithelials, and sometimes it takes a long time for this damage to become apparent. But in the meantime, we know that this stuff isn't particularly healthy for you, and it's kind of another indication that electronic cigarettes are not going to be a great thing going forward. And of particular concern is how a lot of the youth these days are starting to use these because they're viewed as safer. Now, again, this is not at all any kind of confirmation or anything like that yet, but the evidence is more and more pointing to that these things are not safe. They are not a safer alternative and they're going to cause a lot of trouble, at least at a biochemical level. And moving on to news item number 3. This is another last thing coming out from the recently concluded American Thoracic Society conference that was down in Dallas a couple weeks ago. Try and shift over a little bit so we can see that logo on there because it didn't mat out well. But good news, piece of good news coming up on the horizon. A new class of inhaled medications appears to be on its way. There is a medication called, I will inevitably mispronounce this, ensifentrine, which is inhaled currently via nebulizer, created by a company called Verona Pharmaceuticals. And what this ensifentrine does is, many of you may be familiar with the medication called Daliresp. The brand name is Daliresp, generic name is Roflumilast. It's called a phosphodiesterase 4 inhibitor. And what that does is it acts on a particular enzyme, phosphodiesterase 4, and stops that from working. And that has the result of having an anti-inflammatory effect without some of the steroid side effects. So this new medication, inhibits phosphodiesterase 4 and phosphodiesterase 3. And what that seems to do is help with bronchodilation. So we've got this new inhaler that's kind of a combination anti-inflammatory, bronchodilator kind of deal that does seem to have some very positive effects. Interestingly, they had demonstrated some of these before in this what's called a phase 2 study. They found that it was effective, and what they did with this particular study is they also looked at it in the setting of what we call reversible lung disease, which is kind of more along the lines of asthma. We look at how much of your FEV1, that when you blow out, do the blow test, what comes out in that first second. If that changes by a certain degree, depending on which guidelines use, usually it's 200 milliliters and 12% of the baseline. If that has a change, then you have what's considered reversible airway obstruction. And what they found while the FEV1 increases were, as you might expect, more in that group with this medication, the symptom improvements and quality of life improvements were in both groups. So this is definitely an add-on kind of thing to people who maybe don't have a great response to our traditional beta agonist or muscarinic agonist bronchodilators, so that we can get additional bronchodilation support and that anti-inflammatory at the same time. So this is, like I said, this was part of that phase 2 study. Now they're looking at moving on to what's called a phase 3 study, which is a little bit larger group of people, and they look at the results from about 1 to 4 years, so that we can make sure that this is a safe medication and it's effective medication. And then they go into some of the broad scale just prior to release studies. So this is still a little bit a ways off, but the good news is that there is some new stuff on the horizon. It's exciting because we haven't really had a lot of new classes of medications for a while. We've had those beta agonists, we've had the anticholinergics, and we've had the steroids. That's been about it for inhalers. Maybe some inhaled antibiotics if you have one of the more exotic infections or another kind of condition. But this is going to give us a lot of hope for an additional tool to help us make some solid improvements in lung function. So let's see. We will take a break there. That is our news of the week. We will jump into a couple of other housekeeping things real quick. This isn't necessarily a new news item, but it's still on the radar. Medicare is still looking for public input. They're looking at putting ventilators, including non-invasive ventilators like the Trilogy and the Astral device, and some forms of bi-level pressure devices that you use in sleep. Speaking of that sleep study, they're looking at putting those into what's called a competitive billing process, which, without going into all the gory details, has been an utter disaster when it has come to oxygen access in home medical equipment. So the hope then is that we can, as a respiratory health community, as all the stakeholders involved here, clinicians, caregivers, people living with these conditions, we want to encourage Medicare to not destroy the non-invasive ventilator, the ventilator industry, like they've done with oxygen. So if you have a moment, please go to go to this web address right here. It will take you to a very easy to fill out form that can connect you with some of your legislators to encourage them to have Medicare remove ventilators from the competitive bid process, and hopefully we can even start moving the needle a little bit more on oxygen so that we can actually get people the equipment they need. We've seen throughout in the medication, the pharmaceutical side of things, we've seen that there have been massive disasters when we put barriers in place of people accessing what they need and letting accountants make decisions instead of clinicians. We really don't want to see that happen again with more medical equipment. So I encourage everybody, we'll make sure that this link gets out to anybody who needs it also on the page and in the group. Last but not least, in our COPD Navigator group this morning, I did see a link where there was a court decision in favor of the Food and Drug Administration against some of the stem cell clinics that are out there that are, this is a different kind of research than we were talking about with the e-cigarettes a few minutes ago. These are the kind of places that promise cures and things like that, and I did not have time to look into all of the gory details to see how it might affect lung health and the respiratory community, but it did look like an interesting article, and it'll be interesting to see how some of these false claims things move forward. So now let's take a minute to catch our breath, and we'll see. We'll check out some of the comments and things like that here, seeing if more people are saying that the volume is working, more people saying the volume's not working. Who knows? As far as I can tell, it's working okay on my end. I don't know. I'm trying to look at a couple of different things, and the one computer is now freezing up. But in any event, we can look at a couple of other things. We can always... all right, so we've got some people. Thank you, Mary. I'll appreciate a comment on my taste in art there. I can turn the microphone volume up a little bit. Sometimes that helps. It does tend to get a lot of the other ambient noise in here. So if we start, if the water softener starts or something like that, unfortunately, we've got not the, it's a home studio, so you do what you can do. Let's see that. Thank you, Sherry. This is the shirt. Actually, my wife picked out my shirt and my tie. It's a good color combination, I think. Trying to do a little bit more with the jewel tones these days. So, let's see. So we've got going back and forth between watch parties and live videos and all that kind of stuff. Lots of stuff going on. Trying to figure out what the tech issues are. Well, let's before we get started in the education portion of today's program, I want to make sure that we've got everybody on board. Sound is definitely coming out. I personally am going to blame Facebook because that's usually a pretty safe bet. Which means that it's probably going to be time to look for a new streaming provider before too long. Could try some of the YouTube stuff. I know that have had some, Catherine, we're just talking about some of the audio volume. We haven't gotten into the education part today. I had some technical issues and a late start, so never any need to apologize or anything. We are just trying to figure out what all is going on here, because some people can hear, some people can't, and trying to bring this to as big an audience as we can. So trying to help people out as best as possible. Not sure if I can, if there's a whole lot more I can do at this point, so we will go ahead and jump into our topics of the day. And so the biggest thing is we talk a lot about symptom flares or exacerbations, because we as clinicians always like to use 15 syllables when 3 will do just fine. we talk about these things a lot because they are one of the main drivers of loss of overall lung function, which means kind of a loss in exercise tolerance and activity levels and things like that. But we don't always do a very good job at defining what those are. And we found over the years, as we do different studies and stuff like that, we found that a lot of relatively mild exacerbations or flares go unreported because people, especially with a condition like COPD, people often confuse what is a true exacerbation with what is just having a bad day. And spoiler alert, there's not really a great way to, there's not necessarily a hard and fast rule for, yes, this is the beginning of an exacerbation and you need to get this checked out immediately, or no, you just need to wait this one out. Some of it comes down to experience. Some of it comes down to, you folks, everybody knows their body better than anyone else does, especially when you've been around the block a time or two. And maybe you've had an exacerbation and oh, this is what it feels like. We're going to get going here. But there are a couple of things we can do to help point you in that direction and to try to get this stuff as early as possible. So first, let's look at what exactly are we calling an exacerbation. And that can be a question all of itself, because we look here. We see that this is a definition from the American Thoracic Society, and they tell us that an exacerbation is a sustained worsening of the patient's condition from the stable state and beyond normal day-to-day variations that is acute in onset and necessitates a change in regular medication in a patient with underlying COPD. Very formal, very stuffy kind of language, basically telling us that this is a change in your condition, a worsening in your condition over a period of time from what your normal is. Now, you'll note that this definition doesn't tell us what that time frame is. It doesn't tell us what the magnitude of the change is. It doesn't tell us any of those details that would really be very important and very helpful, because honestly, we just don't know what some of those things are. So we can also look at GOLD, which tends to simplify things a little bit, and this tells us that COPD exacerbations are defined as an acute worsening of respiratory symptoms that result in additional therapy. Now, this is arguably a little bit too far on the other side of the spectrum, because we had the long paragraph from ATS. This side, we break it down from GOLD into just a couple of sentences, or a sentence really. This is just one of those days. Anyway, GOLD breaks it down into one sentence there, but again, we have days, people have days where we see and we know that people are going to be having problems. We see those ozone action days in the summertime. We see that in the cold sometimes, or if the humidity is a certain level. There are a dozen different things that you may need some additional therapy than you would normally need. Taking extra albuterol rescue inhaler or nebulizer, that's extra therapy. That, by the GOLD definition, is technically an exacerbation. But that's not something you necessarily need to go to the hospital for, the ER, or even call your doc or your provider for an emergency pack or anything like that. So we really need to get into a little bit more middle road, middle way, middle path there, between having it be so easy that it's one sentence and so complicated that it takes a whole paragraph of fancy medical words in order to get the point across. GOLD tries to do that again a little bit in trying to define what some of the actual levels of an exacerbation are. The first thing that they talk about is a mild exacerbation. This is something that's going to be treated with your short-acting bronchodilators, your rescue inhalers, and that sort of thing. But again, you'll notice there's not a time component to this. And this is why I don't necessarily like this so much, because we get, if we talk about it from this perspective and we start going like this, it's very difficult to prevent people from overreacting, frankly. We encourage people to try to catch these things early and nip them in the bud, but we also don't want to be sending people to the ER every other day because the weather is changing, because it's springtime in Michigan or wherever you're at, and the weather changes. So this is technically true, but this also leaves some room for improvement. Now, next up is the moderate exacerbation, and this is where we're starting to get into kind of the area where people generally think of an exacerbation, a flare, something like that. This is where you're not only taking your rescue inhalers, your rescue medications, you're also taking antibiotics and or corticosteroids on top of that. Now, generally, that means a healthcare encounter. That means going to the ER, calling your provider, doing something to say, hey, I'm having, this is going on. This is the beginnings of an exacerbation. I know it. This happened a year ago about this time, and blah, blah, blah. But there are also a lot of practices out there, and arguably this is becoming best practice, where we're actually able to pre-position, if you will, an emergency pack in somebody's home. We'll write a pre-filled prescription for a short course of antibiotics and a quick burst of steroids to kind of get you back over the hump, and have that in your home. And depending on practice philosophy, sometimes people will or sometimes practices will ask, give us a call and we'll tell you to use your action pack. Or if your symptoms, if you have a home pulse ox, or if you have whatever your system is, however familiar you are with your plans and all that stuff, just go ahead and take it. Sometimes they will just say, give us a call, tell us you're having an exacerbation, and we'll send in the prescription if they're not comfortable pre-filling all those things. So a couple of different potential strategies, but this is where we start getting into that potential risk for exacerbation thing. And then, of course, we have the severe exacerbation, which is where we're actually sending people to the emergency department, maybe getting them admitted to the hospital because they have very low oxygen, or they have what we call respiratory failure, where you just can't catch your breath. And if we do a blood gas, then your carbon dioxide levels are very high. And that's where we start really running into the risk of critical harm to a lot of people, putting them on the breathing machines, the ventilators, all that kind of stuff. So, again, gold kind of gives us a little bit more structure, but it's still not, there's still not really again, hard and fast way to look at some of this stuff, which is frustrating from a clinical side and from like a caregiver or, a patient side. But unfortunately, that's kind of where we are right now, because the best tool that we have for this is this device here called the Exact Pro. And I don't exactly remember what all of the exact acronym stood for, but the Pro means it's a patient-reported outcome testing device. I mean, again, some of the sound effects are not on this end, unfortunately. But in any event, there is this device this tool called the Exact Pro, where this is currently being used in a lot of clinical trials. This is currently where it's been validated, although they're working on it as a maintenance and evaluation tool. But this is where a lot of these symptoms can be reported in a consistent way. Usually what happens is these will be recorded in an electronic diary, like on a tablet or something like that. And these different domains, it came out kind of small because this was a screenshot, but looks at, do you feel congested? Do you have chest tightness? Do you feel tired or weak? Are you scared or worried about your symptoms? Are you feeling short of breath with doing personal care things like showering or brushing your teeth? Do you feel short of breath with outdoor activity? And you measure these, I believe it's a scale from 0 to 5, and you can look at, they have some cutoffs for what they decide is an actual exacerbation when they're doing the clinical trials. Unfortunately, we don't really have access to this tool as an everyday kind of thing, although that does appear to be coming down the pipeline. And we can look at some of these domains for what you should be looking out for when it comes time to figuring out if you have an exacerbation or not. The biggest one is probably shortness of breath. Depending on the kind of COPD that you have, some days you may be more short of breath doing exactly the same activities. Sometimes maybe it's not so bad. The other big one is probably the congestion and the sputum mucus phlegm production, because as people start getting into these exacerbations and flare-ups, they usually start coughing more intensely, and they're bringing stuff up. Now, that brings up an interesting question of, can we potentially use mucus, sputum, phlegm, junk, whatever your preferred word is, as a tool in and of itself? And there's some degree of belief that we can. This is a graphic that came from the Ohio State University Wexler Medical Center that helps us look at the different kinds of sputum colors that are out there, and try to figure out exactly what we can do when we see these different colors. We see they range up from yellow and green, all the way to pink and red, of course, white, probably what most people are hopefully most familiar with, charcoal, grayish color, brown. And some of these work really well. We know that if you have yellow or green sputum, that usually is an indication that you have more dead white blood cells that are building up in there, and they kind of give it this thicker, weirder kind of look. And usually, especially when we start getting into the green, that's kind of a sign of some of the bacterial waste that's in there, and that can be certainly an indicator. We also know that if you're starting to cough up red stuff, that could be a problem, depending on how much it is. Sometimes it just means your throat's a little irritated and you pop the blood vessel. Sometimes it's a little bit more worrisome than that. But the problem is there are a lot of people who have yellow-green sputum every day. It's not necessarily an indication that things are getting worse, or certainly not an indication that things are getting better. It's not necessarily an indication that anything is changing. And that is really what we need to look at when we're looking at symptom flares, when we're looking at exacerbations, when we're looking at flares. We need to look at changes. We know that you have kind of an established baseline every day when you have a chronic respiratory condition, whether it's asthma, whether it's COPD, whether it's a combination of the two, cystic fibrosis, all of these things. Most people have a pretty established baseline. Now, that doesn't mean that every day isn't different, because it's also true that for a lot of people, every day is a little bit different, because the atmosphere is different, because the wind is different, the pressure is different, the humidity is different. We know all that too. But there's usually at least a normal range of variance. It's like looking at an ocean wave. You have, this is kind of the normal thing, and then all of a sudden a boat comes by, and all of a sudden the waves get a lot bigger, and that sort of thing. So that's what we really need to be looking at, is what are those outlier things that are pushing you outside your normal range of symptom burden. And that's when we start looking at having these flares. It's not even necessarily that you have a particular color, it's that the color changes, or the amount changes, or the consistency changes. Also need to remember that, again, we can't just necessarily look at one factor of these things. There was a great article, great from a clinician side anyway, article, it's a little bit dry, a couple years back, about how are we going to start defining and categorizing some of these exacerbations so that we can do a better job of telling people when they need to go to the hospital and when they can just stay home and get it taken care of there. And so this is again a screenshot from a paragraph of that, where we start looking at is the idea of an exacerbation unidimensional? Is there only one thing? Is it an exacerbation if you are just a little bit more short of breath, or if you are just coughing up more stuff? Is that an exacerbation? Probably not. Again, we have the idea of the daily variation is that there are going to be things that are different from one day to the next. And over time, you start kind of getting used to where some of those flare-ups are, what some of the issues are. And then when you start seeing things go outside of that, or if you're short of breath and coughing up more, then that can be a warning sign too. So again, it's not necessarily just one thing at a time. Of course, as with much of medicine, prevention we found is really the key to trying to do successful evaluation of a lot of these exacerbations. There are a lot of things that you can do to try to minimize your risk. Enhance exercise. If you've gone to pulmonary rehab, if you're able to go to pulmonary rehab, if you're able to do any of those kind of exercises. Quitting smoking is a big deal. Making sure that you're using your prescribed medications appropriately, all of those sorts of things. We do know there are things that can minimize your risk of it, and since at the end of the day we want to make sure that they don't happen at all before we even get to the point where we're trying to recognize them, that's kind of the ideal situation. So prevention is the key, but of course we also know that not everything can be presented. So in kind of to sum up here, what we're really looking for is change. Don't necessarily look for a particular trigger. Well, I'm coughing up a lot, I must have an exacerbation. That's not necessarily a thing. Is it different? Is it more? Is it different color? Is it different consistency? Is it different frequency? Those are the early warning signs. We also want to make sure to see what the intensity of the change is, because again, while people usually have that baseline or even that normal range, we want to, if your change doesn't quite hit that, then it's probably just more like the bad day, and you're probably going to feel better in the morning. Maybe you have a day where you take your rescue inhalers every 4 hours instead of waiting until you feel bad or something like that. Maybe you take it a little bit easier. Maybe you stay inside the air conditioning, what have you. If you get to the point where it's beyond that normal range, then you start worrying about whether that's an actual exacerbation. And then finally, there really is a time component involved with this. That is the other thing that a lot of these definitions, when we're looking at it from a clinical perspective, they're throwing it in there for like clinical trials and things like that, but we're not always recognizing that from the perspective of teaching and things like that. I usually tell people it takes a good 36 to 48 hours to really recognize that an exacerbation is occurring, because there are those daily cycles, and because sometimes we even have weather systems that last for a day or two. That's the nature of the beast. You can't just necessarily go with, I have been coughing more for the last 3 hours, I need to go get my Ready Pack or whatever. That doesn't really work, because if that's the thing, then you're probably going to end up in the hospital a lot more than you should, and that's probably what's going to get you actually sick and actually take away some of that lung function. What we need to consider is that we need to find the sweet spot between not waiting too long so that we can still catch it early in the phase and prevent a lot of the worst part of it. But we also don't want to just be crying wolf every single time, when a more basic course of treatment might be a little bit more appropriate. So again, we're looking for the kind of change it is, whether it's a change in exercise tolerance, activity tolerance, change in sputum production, and then how much of that change it is, and then how long has that been going on. So if you're seeing these things outside your normal scope of variation for more than a day and a half or so, that's when you start getting a little bit concerned, and that's when you should probably at least give somebody like me or a primary care provider or whoever is most managing your COPD to at least get their thoughts on it and to figure out what your next move is. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on what we can do for some of the early recognition of symptoms. Again, this is one of those things that doesn't really have a lot of easy answers, because everybody is a little bit different, and a lot of these symptoms have a lot of variation in them, in and of themselves. So hopefully it helps a little bit though, and if you want to share some of your tips for how you're recognizing exacerbations and that sort of thing, we would definitely love to hear about it on this video or in our group COPD Navigator here on Facebook. So now, if anybody's still with us, looks like we got 7 viewers still left, so I appreciate you sticking around through some of the technical breaks there. I would love to send a shout out to a lot of the people who joined us today. We've had 2 Renees, we've had John, Valerie, Mary, Elena, Rob from Wisconsin, I believe, joining, I believe, Angela from Wisconsin, Kelly. My wife joined earlier on. Always nice to see her. Sharon, good to see you. Becky, Susan, Judith from right here in Kalamazoo. Donna, longtime supporter of COPD Navigator. Appreciate everybody stopping by today and spending some of your Wednesday with us. I have no idea what's going on with some of the videos. I tried to do this watch party thing. I think what might have happened is I don't exactly know. I've been working. We had some housework done, some repair work done that did kind of jazz things up a little bit here in the home studio. And I tried to get a little bit more stable connections and things like that instead of depending on the Wi-Fi and everything else. But I think there's still a little bit of drain on the Wi-Fi, and I need to do a little bit more of the connections. So these will be available at some point. I know I'm running a couple episodes behind, but we do get them up on YouTube, and we can get the audio also gets removed and boosted up and then put onto podcast host. So if you have access to an audio device, you can go to Anchor FM and search for COPD Navigator, or if you have a subscription to things like Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, no charge for to subscribe to COPD Navigator, of course, but sometimes it does cost a little bit to access those services. But we are on about a half dozen different podcast distribution systems, so you can at least hear the audio coming out. And again, we're going to be it's going to be on YouTube, and we're looking at what we can do to maybe make a more conducive live setting. The kids these days, I understand, are using a thing called Steam. I think it's Steam, maybe. Oh, that's a streaming site where they can apparently you can sit and watch people play video games. Which even as a longtime gamer myself, I don't really get the appeal of a lot of that for extended periods of time, but I guess that's a thing. So more power to people making money with that. I'm trying to pull up some of the comments on here through my own device, which let's see. So maybe that'll help a little bit. I don't know. The Wi-Fi signal, it does appear to be a little bit iffy, but still, the audio stuff, I really honestly, I'm not trying to make any excuse for it or anything. I honestly have no explanation, because all the technical stuff that I can see on my side, it appears to be working just fine. So hopefully we'll be able to get some insight when we switch to a different host. We'll still, of course, be broadcasting all this stuff as much as possible. And I see Andy's joining us from somewhere, but that is on a different screen. All right. Hey, Andy, well done. Thank you very much. Again, sometimes the difficulty with some of this is we got different comments in different places, so it's hard to keep track of everybody, but I do appreciate everybody stopping by today and joining us for a little bit of talk about COPD. We will be doing this again in hopefully 2 weeks. Gotta check my handy dandy COPD Navigator Live event calendar, which that's not working very well. Nebraska checking in. That's right. Well, I know you're from Nebraska. I didn't know what Facebook page you were watching us on. Now I see what you're talking about. Let's see. So we're coming up, I believe, on the end of the season, actually, a little bit here. This has been quite an eventful spring. As many of you may know, I have a graduating senior from high school. Emma graduates tomorrow evening, as a matter of fact. So really looking forward to going, spending some time with that. That's been a big milestone. Also have a rising senior who, Tommy, just found out he's a drum major, going to be drum major for his marching band in the 2018-2019 season. Nope, 2019, 2020. Had it right the first time. Marching giant drum major, and Joey also, my youngest son, still plowing through middle school. And I also am coming up on a graduation. Finally, going to be finishing my master's in public health, which is exciting. So, this has been quite a thing coming on, or quite a thing through the springtime here. So. Looks like actually this one is the last one that is scheduled at the moment, but we will be doing a couple more of these through June. June, July can get a little bit spotty because we got vacations coming up, family vacations coming up, a little other travel coming up. But then we can always chit chat in our group, COPD Navigator, right here on Facebook. You can also find us on YouTube. Again, on a lot of the podcasting places. Looking forward, trying to create some other shorter things that's been on the agenda for a little while now, until we had some of those flooding issues that we had to get repaired and damaged our filming stuff. But all of that seems to be resolved now, and we will be moving forward with some of those things, hopefully in the very, very near future. So. It doesn't look like we got any other questions coming through today. We'll do one last circuit here, trying to figure out where things are, and where things are going. And so again, apologies to people who were not able to pull up the volume a little bit. Thank you, Susan. Hope you have a good day as well. Make sure all of you out there in Navigator Nation taking care of yourselves, taking care of each other as we get into hopefully out of the allergy season and into the heat season. We will see you back here very soon. I will get a schedule of the next few of these things posted. If you have any suggestions or requests for comments or for topics, make sure you're dropping them in the comment section here, or heading over to our page on Facebook, COPD Navigator, and dropping us there. But until next time, we will see you out there in the internet land. Take care, everybody.